Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
I want to thank President Tran and the leadership of the association for giving me the high honor of being here with you. I am thrilled to be here with such wonderful friends. As I look out on this great group, I see so many people who are just near and dear to me. And I've been thinking about this since I was asked. I am so excited to be here and to be in the presence of some of the great leaders in theological education. I see Dr. Carpenter here and Chuck Foster and Jack Seymour. These are just absolutely tremendous people. So I'm just jumping up and down inside to be with you. My assignment is to, as the president and the leadership have asked me, my assignment is to offer some thoughts about this incredibly important topic. This is one of the most creative topics I have ever seen at any event. So I am, again, very excited and well done. What a fabulous topic. For those of you who don't know me, I teach theology at Duke University Divinity School, and I've been there a long time. And I also want to acknowledge my absolutely wonderful colleague, Fred Edie, who's sitting out there smiling at me right now. Such a wonderful guy. We don't get a chance to talk to each other much on campus, so here we'll catch up. My presentation, Where Violence Lives, Notes for a Pedagogy of Aftermath. In North Carolina, I am surrounded by guns. Now, I grew up in gun culture in Grand Rapids, Michigan, where hunting was a masculinity-forming ritual for so many. My own family did not participate in gun culture, but it was an unspoken, implicit part of life in Western Michigan. My daddy, who saw so many people die through guns, always said to me, "We don't keep a gun in our house, son. The Lord will protect us. We don't need a gun." However, in North Carolina, I live in the midst of a gun culture, the intensity of which is quite overwhelming. North Carolina gun culture, I think, is not unique. I suspect that it is simply the concentrated form of gun culture that dominates this country. Guns are fundamental. One could even speak of them biblically. In the beginning was the weapon. The weapon was with God, and the weapon was God. Without the weapon, nothing that is made can be unmade. And through the weapon, everything that is made can be unmade and made again into the image of the one holding the weapon. The weapon that has remade the world keeps coming into the world, and the world clearly sees the weapon. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ, but security, control, and power come through the weapon. Guns are a signature of this wider reality of the weapon. They participate in its ontology. And friends, guns are beautiful. We who have angled our lives to teach and preach and write against violence often fail to recognize the aesthetic and community-forming power of weapons in general and guns in particular. Guns are formed at the highest levels of craft, creativity, engineering, and technology, and they hold unrelenting seductive power. Hold a beautifully crafted weapon from any era where fine woods and precious metals are forged with delicate precision into a tool that embodies strength, courage, and power, and it would be difficult, maybe even impossible, not to be impressed. Yet the beauty of weapons is coupled with their power to form identity-constituting bonds. I had a student who told me the story of how he bonded with his father around guns. Every Saturday morning, his father would come into his room, sit on the edge of the bed, shake him awake, and would say, "Come on, let's get out of here," and take him to the shooting range. And there, on the shooting range, a father and son were formed as father and son on that range with guns in their hands. The father, the son, and the gun. You got the analogy. The father taught him how to clean, care for, and respect weapons. And one day, his father said the words that he knew was going to come, the words of inheritance. He said, "Son, when I die, all of this will be yours." The father's collection of fine guns would be handed over to the son. The legacy continues. It is precisely this material reality of weapons, the material reality of weapons, and specifically guns, that frames my thoughts on unmaking violence in education. It seems to me that what is greatly needed at this crucial moment, especially in the U.S. context, is a pedagogy of aftermath. Because education is always in the after when it comes to violence. Not only the after effects of violence, but also after our education in violence. A pedagogy of aftermath must reckon with three crucial realities. First, it will take seriously, very seriously, the weapon in its seductive and community-forming realities. We do our work as educators from the sight of the absolute victory of its seduction. Guns for us have an erotic pull and power equal only to the body. After the lucrative industry of pornography, the second lucrative industry in that genre are movies and video games involving lots of guns. Indeed, the United States is inside the weapon, inside its ontology, and the triumph of its seductive powers. This is how I read the religious status of the Second Amendment. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. You can hear the music behind me, can't you? The rights of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. The weapon bound to our bodies is precisely what ensures our freedom, given this confession. Yet the weapon secures all freedom. This is the trajectory that comes out of that confession. It is that trajectory that has established the U.S. as the greatest producer and seller of weapons in the history of the world at this very moment. How might we educate against these specific seductive powers of the weapon, and especially the gun? If I could redo the curriculum of schools in America and the West, there would be two additional requirements, two additional courses at all levels of education, especially theological education. A course on alcohol and one on the gun. Their history, their sociology, their psychology, and especially their spirituality. The question that we educators in the West, and especially in America, have never fully confronted is the question of the spirituality of the gun. What does it mean to do education here in the U.S. from the site of this powerful spiritual formation? Clearly, the unmaking of violence through education must begin with a radical intervention into gun cultures, an insurgency, no pun intended, aimed at their interworking, especially at their formative energies that are so that we might redirect those creative energies toward life and away from death. Redirecting energies, redirecting creative energies is the key here. Challenging the use of fear must certainly be a part, and we know that fear plays a part in this. But fear and terror are not significant enough elements to deepen our analysis of gun culture. Fear and terror have always been within wider narratives of the cultivation of the New World. From the very beginning of the colonial moment, gun culture formed with dreams of masculinity, bound to land ownership. Land ownership carried for immigrants and their children hopes of recognition and significance. The cultivation of the land was bound to the cultivation of a man and to a people. It is this work of cultivation and its close proximity to gun culture that we must think carefully about. Cultivating land, cultivating a man, and gun culture. These things have always been closely together, and there is where our analysis must really begin. It is this close proximity to gun culture that suggests the second reality that we must take seriously, and that is the education that is violent. The education that is violent. We are the inheritors of what I call a pedagogical imperialism. I'm reminded of the very painful story that Ngugi wa Thiong'o tells in his classic text, Decolonizing the Mind, of being shamed and beaten with a rod by his English colonial teachers in Kenya for speaking or writing English poorly, or for speaking his native tongue. Western education is inside the history of civilizing subjects and subjectivities formed inside the violent work of transforming land and body into civilization. We do our work as religious educators not only from the site of weapon production and gun culture, but also always in the wake of civilizing wounds. Civilizing wounds. Like so many others, I survived school. Yeah. And that survival was not a matter of successfully navigating the awkwardness of adolescence. It was literally survival by every means at my disposal to overcome the assaults on my body, then on my mind, and finally on my psyche and my spirit through every stage of my educational process, right into being a professor. I survived the competitive and chivalric culture that dominates the highest levels of higher education, especially in the theological academy. I survived where others were destroyed. And all along the way, I was schooled through and in the pedagogical imperialism that gave rise to Western colonial-shaped education and Western imperialism. That imperialism fundamentally positioned and positions white bodies as always teachers and the world, especially a world of non-white bodies, as always eternal students. It grew out of the supersessionist habit of mind of New World Christians who imagined themselves ordained and predestined by God to teach the world the truth of God. And it solidified through the seizing and controlling of land, animals, and indigenous peoples. Pastoral control of land and space joined pastoral control of bodies in the colonial logic of Christian settlers in the New Worlds to birth a vision of education that is both policing and assimilationist. If one resisted this vision, one was narrated as disobedient, already bound in and toward criminality. If one yielded, then one entered a world of evaluation within which people were introduced to those tortured calculations that we all know so well. Those tortured calculations that we all know so well of cultural allegiance or betrayal, cultural authenticity or inauthenticity, of being temporally aligned with uplift and advancement, or being seen as backward, underdeveloped, of the old, of the primitive. The idea of progress and the judgments against flesh that came with that idea, it has never died. It has simply gone epidermal. The ideological state apparatus of education, as Althusser said over 50 years ago, continues to teach us how to read progress through bodies marked by race and gender. Black and brown bodies in our day and time are surrounded by an optic regime that binds police surveillance to academic evaluation. But this is not new. It grew out of life on the hacienda, the reservation school, the plantation, and the slave ship. Theological education has always been slow to see its own parental role in this imperialism, and even slower to grasp the ways we are yet accomplices in this violent work. Pedagogical imperialism gave rise to Western imperialism, as I said, but more to our concern, pedagogical imperialism robbed Christian theological educators of our most important gift and skill. We draw people of faith into the mobility, the adaptability and flexibility of being learners. And we have been robbed of the deep richness of this skill. We were denied the slow and beautiful evolution of nothing less than an incarnational logic embedded centrally in our educational practice of expanding our identities by joining the lives and ways of life of others. We were to follow a God born of Mary, who learned and then taught. Who learned and then taught. We live, however, in the aftermath of that denial, which brings me to my third and final reality that must be reckoned with, and that is the normalization of death for black and brown bodies. The normalization of death for black and brown bodies. We do our work in the break. We do our work in the break. In the silence, like that of a musical break between movements, where violence is being prepared to answer back to violence, where violence is being prepared to answer back to violence, or to create a new possibility through violent means. If there's anything we have learned from Ferguson and my dear sister's wonderful presentation shows us, we live in that break. And black life is always in the break. And we have heard the before and after for so long that we have grown accustomed to it, like white noise. It is so constant that we cannot hear it anymore. Black death in America has reached a sanctioned ubiquity. I have this morbid fascination that I have to confess to you all. A morbid fascination that I carry into every movie and every television show that I like to watch. I love science fiction especially. This is especially the case in science fiction. And it can be summed up with one simple question. What will happen to the black people? Or should I say more precisely, when are they going to die? Because they are going to die. No matter what science fiction flick it is, black people are going to die. When I tell my class this, they always come back and say, you have ruined science fiction for us for the rest of our lives. And it's true in the strangest science fiction. At some point in time, before the movie's over, you've got to kill off all the black people. Except the Matrix. That was the only one that left a few of us alive. Inevitably, something bad, something that marks black and brown bodies, as the writer Abdul R. John Muhammad calls, marks black and brown bodies as death-bound subjects will appear. Black people always die. Black people always die. And they are always near the chaos, and especially the chaos of death. This normalizing of black death flows through the political and social unconsciousness of the West. And it is coordinated spatially through the geographic formations and formulations of land development and distribution of property. It's as though, in terms of land developers and real estate and property, that there is this huge cloud over black bodies, as though the lightning is going to strike, and the first thing you must do is move away from that body, because the lightning will soon strike. As Carl Nightingale suggests in his groundbreaking text on segregation, spatial segregation has always carried more than a policing and controlling function. Segregation has always gestured toward genocide. We have to reckon more seriously with geographic violence and the spatial conjuring of death that surrounds our work as educators. There are then three crucial questions that I want to raise for us today. The first I've already mentioned, but it needs repeating. How might we educate against the specific seductive powers of the weapon, and especially the gun? How might we educate against the specific seductive powers of the weapon, and especially the gun? How might we intervene into the spirituality of the gun and the formation powers of gun culture? How might we intervene into the spirituality of the gun and the formation powers of gun culture? Secondly, how might we detect and begin to address the pedagogical imperialism at work in our institutions and in the formation processes we engage students in? How might we begin to detect and address the pedagogical imperialism at work in our institutions and in the formation processes we engage students in? How might we overturn the logics, the evaluative logics that are always deployed against non-white bodies? how might we begin? How might we overturn the evaluative logics that are always deployed against non-white bodies? And finally, dear friends, how might we challenge the sanctioned ubiquity and normalization of Black death? How might we challenge the sanctioned ubiquity and normalization of Black death, and how that normalization is coordinated through the distributions of bodies in geographic spaces of neighborhoods and communities? How might we challenge the sanctioned ubiquity and normalization of Black death, and how that normalization is coordinated through the distribution of bodies in the geographic spaces of neighborhoods and communities? Thank you very much.